I've been staring at this stack of research you sent over for the last 3 days, and it feels heavier than usual.
It is a lot to get through.
Yeah, and I don't just mean physically heavy, though it is a massive amount of paper. I mean the weight of the actual subject. We usually cover history or science on this deep dive, but today we are looking at something that functions as the operating system for over 1 billion people.
Right.
We are talking about Sahih al-Bukhari.
It really is the source code. That is probably the best analogy you could use. For Sunni Muslims, the Quran is the Constitution. It's the divine, unchangeable word.
The foundation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Sahih al-Bukhari is the Supreme Court case law. It explains how to actually do the religion, how you pray, how you marry, how you buy and sell. You really cannot live a traditional Sunni life without this book.
Which makes it so essential, and that's why I was so fascinated by this one document you included in the file. It's titled The 100 Taboo Questions.
Yeah, that one stands out.
It sounds like a clickbait title, right? But reading through it, this is serious stuff. It's a compilation of critiques coming from everywhere. You've got academic historians, Shia scholars, modernists, ex-Muslims. They are all pulling at the loose threads of this massive tapestry.
And that is exactly why this deep dive is so tricky to navigate.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you pull too hard on those threads, well, for the traditional believer, the whole structure of how we know what we know starts to unravel.
So that's our mission today. If you're joining us, we aren't just doing a dry biography of a scholar, we're playing detective.
I like that.
We need to understand who this man was, how he built what is essentially the most rigorous truth filter of the ancient world, and then we have to look that controversy right in the eye. We're talking about everything from the age of Aisha to the infamous fly in the drink.
And we have to do it fairly. We have to look at why the critics say these things break the faith, and then why the defenders say the system is actually working exactly as designed.
Impartially reporting the facts. So let's start with the man himself, Imam al-Bukhari, Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Ismail, born in 810 CE. The very first thing that jumped out at me was the geography, Bukhara.
Right.
That is in modern-day Uzbekistan.
And that context is absolutely crucial. We're not in the Arab heartland here. We're in the Persianate world, way out on the eastern frontier of the Abbasid Empire.
So it's a shift in where the intellectual center is.
Exactly. This is a time when Islamic scholarship was moving from the deserts of Arabia to these really cosmopolitan cities in Central Asia.
In his origin story, I have to say, reading the traditional accounts, it has this distinct hero's journey quality to it. Specifically, the part about his blindness.
It really does. The tradition says he lost his sight at a very young age. His mother, who is portrayed as this incredibly pious, tenacious woman, prays incessantly for him. And the story goes that she sees the prophet Ibrahim in a dream.
Abraham.
Right, Abraham. And he tells her, your son is healed. Then Bukhari wakes up the next morning and his vision is sharp.
And look, whether you view that as a literal miracle or as hagiography, it perfectly sets up the central theme of his life. Vision. But not just physical eyesight, insight, and specifically memory, because the numbers associated with his memory are just mind-boggling. I read that he memorized 1 million hadiths.
Yeah, that number trips everyone up.
Because it sounds physically impossible. I actually did the math on this. If you live to be 60, that is memorizing dozens of unique statements every single day from the moment you were born.
Well, here is where we have to define our terms carefully. In the science of hadith, they didn't count unique sentences the way we do today. They counted the chains, the tesnad.
Okay, break that down for me.
So imagine I tell you a quote, the sky is blue. That is the text, the matan.
Okay, the payload.
Right. Now imagine I heard that from John, who heard it
Right.
from Dave. That chain, me to John to Dave, that is one hadith. Now if I tell you the exact same quote, the sky is blue, but this time I heard it from Sarah, who heard it from Mike, that counts as a second hadith.
Ah, I see. So the payload, the quote itself, might be identical, but the routing path is different.
Exactly. It's about the data pathways. So when historical sources say he knew hundreds of thousands of hadiths, they mean he knew the web of transmission.
The metadata.
Yes. He knew who told who, when they met, where they lived, and who their teachers were. It was this massive mental database of biographical data.
Which honestly makes the end of his life so much more tragic to read about. You have this celebrity scholar, this walking encyclopedia, arguably the most famous man in the Muslim world at the time, and he dies in exile.
In total isolation.
What actually happened there? I was reading about the Mina, this Inquisition. This was the government trying to force a specific theology.
Yes. The Abbasid state was trying to enforce the rationalist doctrine of the Mu'tazila. Specifically, they were pushing the idea that the Quran was created by God at a specific point in time, rather than being God's eternal, uncreated speech.
Which sounds like intense theological hair-splitting to us today.
It does, but back then, it was a strict loyalty test.
Like a political purge.
Exactly. If you didn't agree, you were tortured or imprisoned. Now, Bukhari tried to navigate this with a lot of nuance. He basically said, the Quran is God's speech and is uncreated, but my recitation of it, the actual sounds coming out of my physical throat, those are created actions.
That sounds remarkably logical.
It is. But his rival in the city of Nishapur, a scholar named Al-Duli, used that nuance to frame him as a heretic. He basically canceled him. He told the public not to attend Bukhari's classes.
So he gets run out of Nishapur, but then he goes back to his hometown, Bukhara, and gets run out of there too.
That second exile was purely political. The governor of Bukhara wanted Bukhari to come to the palace and privately tutor his children.
Let me guess. Bukhari said no.
He completely refused.
Right.
He said, I will not humiliate knowledge by carrying it to the doors of the sultans. If they want knowledge, they can come to the mosque and sit with everyone else.
I love that. And honestly, it's a really strong defense against the modern critics who claim these hadith scholars were just government stooges fabricating religion for the caliphs. I mean, Bukhari literally chose exile over selling out.
He did. He died alone in a small village called Kartank on the night of Eid, having been rejected by the world. It is a very somber ending.
So that is the man. Independent, brilliant, tragic. Now let's look at the machine he built, the filter. Because Sahih al-Bukhari isn't just a book, it's a highly filtered data set. You highlighted some math in the notes that really puts it in perspective. He started with about 600,000 narrations.
Roughly 600,000 chains of transmission that he had either memorized or collected.
And the final book has about 7,000.
And that includes repetitions. If you look at the unique texts, the unique stories without the repeating chains, it's somewhere between 2,200 and 2,600.
I ran the numbers on that too. That is an acceptance rate of about 0.37%.
It is brutal.
That implies that 99.6% of what was out there circulating got rejected. So when critics say, oh, hadiths are just folklore and gossip, the defenders would just say,
They would say, we know. That is exactly why Bukhari threw 99% of it away. He wasn't collecting the folklore, he was acting as the firewall against it.
so what was the specific criteria? What made that 0.37% so special? I know other scholars demanded honest narrators, the adl, and precise memory dat, but Bukhari had a secret sauce, right? The Lika condition.
Yes, this is the key technical difference that sets him apart. His contemporary, Imam Muslim, who wrote the second most authentic book, had a standard called musara. That means contemporaneousness.
Okay.
If narrator A and narrator B lived in the same time period and practically could have met, Imam Muslim accepted the transmission, assuming they were generally honest people.
Like innocence until proven guilty. If they were in the same city at the same time, we just assume they met.
Right. But Bukhari said, no, not good enough. He demanded Lika. He needed positive proof, a specific date, a witness, or a textual reference that narrator A and narrator B actually sat in the exact same room and exchanged data at least once.
That is a significantly higher bar. That's the difference between saying they both lived in New York in 1990 and saying we actually have a photo of them having coffee together.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that rigid standard is why Sahih al-Bukhari sits at the very top of the pyramid.
But, and here's the big but from the skeptics, we are still talking about an oral tradition. Even with the strictest filters, you are relying on human memory over roughly 200 years. The telephone game argument is the first thing any Western historian brings up.
It is always the first critique. The modern skeptical view is that human memory is deeply fallible, and stories naturally grow in the telling.
So how do the defenders respond to that? Do they just say these guys had better brains?
Partly, yes. They argue that we are projecting our modern Google brain weakness onto a culture where poetry and genealogy were exclusively oral and highly trained. But there is a much stronger historical argument that has gained a lot of ground recently. The Sahifas.
I saw that term in the research. These are notebooks.
Yes. We used to think the tradition was entirely oral until the formal books were written in the 800s. But recent scholarship has found that students in the 700s, the very early generations, were actually writing down what their teachers said in private notebooks. Those are the Sahifas.
So Bukhari wasn't just pulling this from the air.
No. He was often cross-referencing oral claims against these private written collections that had been carefully passed down.
So it wasn't a game of telephone.
Exactly. It was a hybrid system of oral verification backed up by written notes.
That changes the picture significantly. But let's pivot. The methodology sounds airtight on paper, but the reason we are doing this deep dive is because of what actually got through that filter: the content controversies.
This is where the rubber meets the road.
We have to talk about the fly.
The famous fly hadith.
It is the absolute favorite example for online atheists and critics. The text in Bukhari basically says, if a fly falls into your vessel, dip it all the way in, for in one wing is the disease, and in the other is the cure.
It's very visceral.
Yeah.
And for a modern person who is raised on germ theory, the idea of dunking a dirty insect into your drink to sanitize it sounds absolutely backwards.
So how do defenders handle this? Do they just say, well, Bukhari made a mistake here?
No. And this is really crucial to understand. Traditionalists almost never concede an error in Bukhari.
Why not?
Because if you admit one hadith is completely fake, you admit the entire methodology, the Isman system, can fail. And if the system can fail on a fly, can it fail on how to pray? Can it fail on contract law?
So they have to defend the fly to save the entire system.
Exactly. And they do it in two ways. First, the theological defense. The prophet is speaking from divine revelation, not a medical school textbook. If God says there is a cure on the wing, there is a cure, even if our current microscopes can't see it yet.
And the second defense?
The second is scientific, and this actually surprises a lot of people. Defenders point to modern research on bacteriophages.
Bacteriophages.
Viruses that actively eat bacteria. Since the early 20th century, scientists have known that flies carry distinct antimicrobial factors, often on their bodies or wings, simply to survive the absolute filth they live in. Some scholars argue the cure mentioned is just a pre-scientific reference to these biological antidotes.
It feels a little bit like reverse engineering the science to fit the ancient texts, doesn't it?
To a skeptic, absolutely it does. To a believer, though, it is a clear sign of divine insight that science is only just now catching up to.
Let's move to something heavier: the gender issue, and specifically the age of Aisha.
This is arguably the #1 ethical hurdle for the modern Western Muslim. Bukhari records that Aisha was betrothed at 6 and the marriage was consummated at 9.
Which, by today's standards, is obviously shocking. It raises massive questions about child protection and modern ethics.
Correct. And critics lean on this heavily to attack the moral standing of the entire tradition.
Now, I have seen some modern apologists and even some scholars try to do this sort of math gymnastics to prove she was actually 18 or 19. They look at the age of her sister Asma and calculate dates to find a discrepancy.
Yes, the revisionist approach.
Right, so do traditional scholars accept that? It seems like an easy out. Oh look, the math says she was 18, problem solved.
You would think so, but generally they completely reject it.
Why? That seems counterintuitive.
Because of the system again. The revisionist argument relies on historical reports that are much, much weaker than Bukhari's standards. The age 9 report is in Bukhari, with a absolute gold standard chain of transmission. If you throw out a Sahih hadith just because it makes you uncomfortable in the 21st century, you have effectively admitted that your modern feelings trump the isnad.
It's that epistemological crisis again. If you break the filter to save the ethics, you lose the text entirely.
Exactly. So traditionalists bite the bullet. They accept the age, but they contextualize it. They argue that in 7th century Arabia, adulthood was defined by biology, by puberty, not by a specific number. They also heavily point out that Aisha went on to be a massive political leader, a top scholar, and a general, which implies she wasn't some passive victim. But they will not change the number.
Sticking with gender, there is another phrase that comes up a lot in the taboo questions list. The text says women are deficient in intellect and religion. Ouch. That sounds pretty indefensible on its face.
It sounds terrible to the modern ear, yes. It's frequently cited as definitive proof of inherent misogyny in the text. But here, the defense is entirely about translation and context.
Walk us through that defense.
Defenders argue that deficiency in religion isn't a spiritual flaw at all. It actually refers to the fiqh, the legal ruling, that women are physically exempt from prayer and fasting during menstruation.
So it's a technicality.
Right. It's a technical reduction in mandatory religious duties, a mercy basically, not a reduction in spiritual worth or closeness to God.
And what about the intellect part?
They tie that directly to a Quranic verse about witness testimony in financial contracts, where 2 women were required to replace 1 man. Defenders argue this was about the social reality of that very specific era. Women generally did not deal with commercial markets back then, so they needed a backup witness to corroborate complex financial details. They argue it's a commentary on the legal technicalities of the 7th century, not a blanket statement about female IQ.
It still feels like a heavy lift to reconcile that with modern views on total equality.
It absolutely is, and that is the tension you, as a listener, have to navigate. Is this book a timeless, literal window into the absolute truth? Or is it a recording of a patriarchal 9th century legal system interpreting the 7th century?
Speaking of legal systems, let's talk about punishment. We have hadiths in Bukhari about stoning for adultery and the death penalty for apostasy, meaning leaving the religion.
Right, these are explicitly in the text. And to many, they seem to directly contradict the clear Quranic verse, "Let there be no compulsion in religion."
So how do you square no compulsion with kill the one who changes his religion?
The nuance usually offered by scholars is in the definition of religion versus the state. In the pre-modern world, there was really no such thing as secular citizenship. Your religion was your citizenship.
So leaving Islam was basically like defecting to the Romans.
Exactly. It was viewed as literal treason. Defenders argue these severe penalties were specifically for public rebellion and high treason against the state, not for a private, quiet change of heart in your own home.
That actually brings us perfectly to the sectarian divide. We mentioned early on that the 100 taboo questions includes critiques from Shia scholars. Why do they look at Bukhari so differently?
This is a massive point of contention.
Right.
The Shia critique is incredibly simple, but powerful. If this is the most authentic book of the Prophet's words, why are there almost no narrations from the Prophet's own family? The al-Bayt.
Yeah, Bukhari lived at the same time as several of the Shia imams, like Imam al-Hadi. Why didn't he just interview them?
That is the elephant in the room. Shia scholars argue that Bukhari, whether consciously or unconsciously, filtered out the family in favor of the companions and the established state narratives of the time.
But I noticed in the research he did include people who literally fought against Ali, right? Like pro-Umayyad figures.
He did. And this is where the Sunni methodology gets really specific and interesting. Sunni methodology separates a narrator's politics from their truthfulness.
Meaning what exactly?
Meaning you could be a political rebel, a heretic, or even someone who actively hates the Prophet's family. But if you are known by everyone to never tell a lie, if you are scrupulously honest in your speech, Bukhari might still accept your data. Shia methodology completely rejects that. They say if you oppose the rightful imam, your spiritual integrity is zero, so your data is zero.
That is a fundamental clash in how you even view truth. Is truth independent of a person's character, or is it tied to their loyalty?
Exactly. It's two completely different paradigms.
Let's hit one last structural controversy. The funnel. I was reading about this guy, Firabri.
Muhammad ibn Yusuf al-Firabri.
Yeah. It seems like thousands of people heard Bukhari teach in his lifetime, but the version of the book we actually have today, the physical text, relies almost entirely on this one single student's transmission.
This is known as the single point of failure theory. Critics ask a very fair question. What if Firabri made a mistake? What if he added a margin note that later scribes thought was part of the core text?
It has to be a terrifying thought for a believer, the idea that this massive legal framework rests on one guy's copy editing skills.
It is. The defense, of course, is that Firabri wasn't operating in a vacuum. The text was already being quoted, commented on, and debated by hundreds of other scholars simultaneously across the empire. If Firabri had gone rogue and changed a whole paragraph, the scholarly community in Baghdad or Cairo would have flagged the discrepancy immediately.
So a sort of cloud backup existed.
In the collective memory and writings of the broader scholarly community, yes.
We have covered a massive amount of ground here. The biography, the rigorous math, the fly, the gender wars, the sectarian split. When you step back from all of this, how do we synthesize it?
I think you end up with two completely distinct worldviews, looking at the exact same object.
So the historian and the believer?
Exactly. The historian looks at Sahih al-Bukhari and sees a brilliant 9th century artifact. It reflects the theological debates, the patriarchy, the politics, and the sheer intellectual brilliance of the Abbasid era. It is a human masterpiece, but it is deeply human.
And the believer?
The believer sees a lifeline. They see a providential, almost divinely guided effort to save the prophet's words from oblivion. They argue that the problematic parts aren't errors, but tests of faith, or simply things we lack the full context to understand yet. They emphasize that you can't just read this book casually like a novel. It requires a layer of expert interpretation, fiqh, to decode it properly.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener? Why should you care about a book compiled in the 800s?
Because whether you view it as absolute divine guidance or just a fascinating historical archive, Sahih al-Bukhari is the lens. You cannot understand the Islamic world today. You can't understand the ongoing debates about women's rights, democracy, law, or extremism without understanding the gravity and authority of this book. It is the ultimate battleground of ideas.
And I think that leads us perfectly to a final thought. You mentioned something in the notes about probability that really stuck with me.
Zini.
Yeah, even Bukhari's staunchest defenders, the classical scholars themselves, acknowledged this limitation. They said the Quran is qati, definitive, but Bukhari is zani, speculative or probabilistic knowledge.
Right. They openly admitted there is a non-zero chance of human error. It is the most authentic human effort possible, but it is not God.
And that is the provocative question we want to leave you with today. Does acknowledging that humanity, that 0.01% chance of error, does that actually save the text by giving it room to breathe and adapt? Or does pulling that one tiny thread unravel the entire sweater?
That is the question every single generation has to answer for itself.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll catch you on the next session.